So I suggest that we start now. We have some will join us a bit later. So we are really happy to have our first visitors from Paris, from Ecole Normale Supérieure. It's a great school with great research in cognitive psychology and psychology and modeling and cognitive neuroscience. And I think that the topics of this school are quite relevant for our research. This is the first visitor from this school, but we expect more visitors. So we hope to build a partnership with Paris. So we will get lectures from Paris. Hopefully we will be able to send our students to Paris sometime. We are now in negotiations of some kind of partnership. We will be very happy to get a lot of lectures here in our university. So I will tell you a few words about this project. So we also associate this or link this presentation to our new program in cognitive science, cognitive technologies. As you see on this slide, this is the very first presentation of this web page. So nobody knows about this web page except you. So we will launch this project on September. That will be the first English-speaking program in cognitive sciences, and cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology. So it will have two tracks, in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. So if you will type, if you will go to our Faculty of Psychology webpage and at Cognitor, you will find this webpage. Soon you will find the link on the central webpage as well. So next year in September we'll launch the first English-speaking program in cognitive sciences and cognitive neuroscience in Russia. Please make a look at this program. So I will also tell a few words about the development in the faculty. So in December we will launch our research center. So in December we will have 3 eye trackers, 2 multi-channel imaging systems, 1 TMS system, and we have a great partnership with Professor Stroganov, who is present here in this room. So we made already now some projects at the MEG Center. So we have a lot of very influential modeling techniques available in this university together with our faculty. So I think quite soon we will be able to conduct very interesting studies in our faculty. And also we will introduce English-speaking programs. So I'm really happy that we start this development as a distinguished lecture by Emmanuel Dupoux. And I think Anna Shestakova, who will be the director of our research center, will introduce formally when they will.
Now, we had the other 2 slides, sorry. Formally introducing our precious guest from Paris, Professor Emmanuel Dupoux, who specializes in modeling of early acquisition of language in infants and children. Travels along with his colleague, researcher Alex Christia, who will be happy to answer questions about infrared spectroscopy, and I hope that Emmanuel will spend 1 slide at least on this very daunting neurophysiological technique. And the lecture will be mainly devoted to language acquisition and modeling of early language acquisition in infants. And so, like you, I'm looking forward to listen to all these interesting things about modeling, models in neuroscience, in cognitive sciences, and psycholinguistics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, well, I'm very honored to be inaugurating the first series of lectures that is going to take place here. I'm also very impressed by this extremely dynamic program and ideas you all have about bringing together various strands of research in cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own interest and work in the area of early language acquisition. And so this is going to be, unfortunately, part of the talk may be a little bit technical, so if I'm completely obscure, it makes no sense to you, please don't hesitate to interrupt and ask questions, clarification questions. I will be very happy to do so, and I hope I won't be too obscure. let's see how it goes. So I'm interested in language acquisition, and I've been doing that for years. And one of the things that has been a bit frustrating in this field is that for the most part, people are approaching language acquisition with their intuitions. I mean, how is it that babies are learning languages? And we sort of basically take the viewpoint of the mother who don't understand why the baby does not do what they are supposed to do, and the language should be very easy to understand because we just talk to babies and that's it. But of course, from the viewpoint of the baby, the situation is completely different. The baby is hearing some kind of signal, noisy signal, which could be, I mean, any kind of vocalization, and so they have very little idea of what's going on there. Now, in particular, one of the problems that arises is that in order to make sense of the situation, babies will have to learn many things about the language. They have to learn what are the constituent sounds, the phonemes of the language, what are the words, what do they mean, what are the syntactic relationships, what is the meaning of these elements, etc., etc. And this is a problem. They have to do that without knowing anything else about the language. So really, this is called the bootstrapping problem. Babies have to learn all these linguistic levels at the same time. Okay. So if you look at what we know about language acquisition, based on lots of experiments have been accumulated over the past 20 or more years. So this timeline here shows you, so this is baby times baby age in terms of months, so between 0 and 14 months. And these are the different areas where experiments have shown some achievement of babies, okay? Starting at different levels. So you have here in segments the sounds of the language, consonants and vowels. So they start to be sensitive to properties of the native sounds in the environment quite early, around 5-6 months. They start to know all other properties of the language also at the level of suprasegments, the prosody, but also the lexicon. They recognize some names. They can also make out some meanings of words very, very early. So all this is taking place before they really can talk. Okay, so they start to babble basically, but then the words, the first words comes later with respect to these early achievements. So babies can understand, start to make sense of the language around them before they can talk. So how can they do that? If you open up books or journals on child development, you will see that there are many proposal theories that are being proposed. They have various names. I won't detail any of these, but in my opinion, these proposals are, I would call them more frameworks than theories, because what they are is they are sort of ways to put together this vast array of results that we know about the early language achievements in babies. They are not really what would be comparable to theories in physics, for instance, where you can make predictions and you can test them with experiments. Again, there are more sort of ideas of, well, maybe babies are paying attention to the sounds, or they're paying attention to the meaning, and they are interacting with parents. And that's a nice way to describe what's going on, but at least for my taste, this is not enough. I mean, we want really to have theories that we can test. So then we can move to the area of computational linguistics. And in computational linguistics, people are proposing actual mechanisms that can account for part of the learning that's going on in babies. Okay. And so, for instance, there are people who have been trying to see how you could go from raw speech to finding the phonemes using some kind of non-supervised clustering mechanisms. Other people have been focusing on, if you have phonemes, can you extract word forms by trying to find where the boundaries are? You can also have people have been working on grammar induction, where they start with both the word forms and the phoneme and try to extract the rules of the language, etc., etc. So you find in the computational linguistic literature lots of proposals of these different mechanisms that are highly relevant to what the child is doing. They are actually solving part of the problem. However, the problem we have right now is that these are sort of isolated fragments of learning mechanisms. They don't constitute a theory either. They constitute proposals for particular mechanisms, but the question is, can we put this together and make a theory? And so that's basically what I'm trying, that's my aim there. Of course, it's a very ambitious aim, as you will very soon realize. It's a very difficult thing to do. So one of the easy things you could try is simply concatenate these different elements. Okay, you have this going through speech to phonemes, and then phonemes to words, and then words to semantics. Well, why not just putting all this together and saying that's my theory of language acquisition? Well, as I'm going to try to illustrate, this doesn't work at all. Okay, and one of the reasons is that all these learning elements are supposed to work in isolation and in a strictly bottom-up fashion. But when you look in detail, you will find that there are a lot of problems there. Is that all of these have been developed with either simplifying assumptions about the input or assumptions about what the other part of the system is doing, such that when you put them together, they just completely crash. So I'm going to concentrate for illustration on this little box there. That's the basic entry that babies are receiving speech and they have to find the phonemes. Okay, let's try to see how this could be done. Okay, so if you actually open some of the psycholinguistic journals, you think that this problem has been solved. Because you find papers, first of all, describing that babies are slowly, during the first year of life, zooming in on the native sounds of the language. So we know that they do it. So in this experiment, babies are asked to discriminate two sounds that do not belong to their language. So this is the Hindi ta and ta, which if you are Hindi you can hear. I'm not sure I have made it correctly anyway, but if you're not, it's quite difficult. And babies are able to do that, make distinction. English babies are able to do that, but they are slowly losing this ability in contact with their native language, which in the case of English do not contrast ta and ta. Okay? However, in the infants continue to do the distinction. This is performance. This is number of babies that pass the test. Okay? Now, how could this be done? One simple idea that has been around a lot is that babies are basically extremely good statisticians and phoneticians at the same time. They are able to register each instance of ta and ta, okay, and put them into some kind of representation of acoustic space. And once they have done that, they are able to construct categories by clustering them. So that would be one ta and another ta, for instance. And then, as they hear more and more examples, they are able to build the categories. And there are even experiments constructed with artificial languages that purport to show that babies are able to do that. Okay, so this is all nice. And then there are a bunch of modeling papers, computational modeling papers that demonstrate that indeed, if you basically present something. So this is an example of a distribution of sounds in VOT, which is the voice and same time. That's one of the parameters that can distinguish consonants, for instance. And so when you construct stimuli like this, then you can construct also algorithms that successfully cluster these sounds into the relevant number of categories. Now, the slight problem with all these papers is that they are, if you look at them in detail, you discover that they are not really looking at the learning of phoneme categories from raw speech. They are all dealing with some kind of simplified input that have been extracted from the speech and basically hand-drawn so that they would basically, okay, so you measure something like this, you construct a little Gaussian distributions around it. And so these are the two categories, and then you construct an algorithm that will extract that. So that's nice, but in reality, if you were to draw the distribution for real speech sounds, you would have something more like this, okay, with a lot of overlap. And that's where the problem starts to rise. Does it scale? So now if you start to play with real speech, here you have, for instance, a spectrogram of speech. So this is time, and this is here frequency, and this is here time, and this is basically the amplitude of the signal. And you see that, for instance, there are two versions of the same sound R that are rising in this sentence. And if you look at the spectrogram or the waveform, they look quite different, actually, from one another. So it's really difficult to see how you could cluster them. And indeed, so what I've started to do with some of my colleagues in speech engineering was to say, okay, let's try to build a system that will automatically discover the sounds from the raw speech, not from simplified input. So there we were using some hidden Markov model, which some of you may know, I don't know. So it's basically the idea that you can represent a sequence of sounds by an underlying sequence of discrete states, and each of the states is generating a probability distribution over some of your input parameters. Okay? So typically this kind of system are used in a supervised setting. If you have your Dragon Dictate software, they are using HMM like this, but having trained with specifying labels, teaching the system how many phonemes there are in English and where to segment them. Now, what we want to do is the same thing, but without any labels. We want the system to automatically discover where the segments start and how many segments there are and what are the characteristics. So we played with an algorithm that was developed by Professor Sagayama, which starts with an HMM extremely simple, one HMM for the whole set of sounds and sentences. Okay, just one sound. And then it will progressively split up these states into substates. Either like this, saying, this is saying there are two different types of sentences, and this one is saying, well, they are beginning and ends of sentences. And you split them, and you can continue to split and split and split until you have a very complicated picture, a very complicated network with different states. I'm always getting back to computing, not using that. So in this work that we did in collaboration with Sandeep Udampour and Balakrishnan in Hopkins, we grew a network like this to something like about 500 states, which I can't draw here. I only drew a simplified version. But then the question is, now we have a very, very big network. How do you know that it's what it's doing? So you have to inspect the states of the network to be able to discover what are these units coding for. So one way to discover that is to try to associate each of the symbols states there with a phoneme. When you do that, it doesn't work at all, because in fact we discovered that the states were coding for something much smaller than a phoneme, something like a fraction of a phoneme. So the next thing we tried to do was to associate states with a sequence of states with phonemes. So in this table we listed the most frequent sequences of states and tried to see whether it was corresponding to something like a phoneme. Okay? And actually it doesn't. Well, it sort of does at the same time and doesn't. So for instance, this sequence of states most of the time corresponds to the phoneme T, but only in specific context. It's the T only when it's followed by these three vowels and preceding it by another vowel. Okay? If there's a T in another context, for instance between consonants, then it's a different sequence of states completely. Okay, so the two characteristics of this network that was basically trying to operate on this idea of clustering the sounds is that the units are smaller than phonemes and they are context dependent. They depend on the context. Okay? The third property that we didn't discover at that time was that if you try to train this network on a given talker and you apply it to decode speech in another talker, it doesn't work at all. So the units are also extremely talker dependent. Okay, so just to go back to try to understand what was going on, this is the speech sound again. As I showed you in the preceding example, the phonemes are not discrete states. They are basically continuous trajectories in the spectrogram. So it's not really surprising that you can't find them if you do clustering. It's not like if you were, I don't know, to do clustering on vocalization of words, where you can really see isolated syllables that are easy to segment. For human vocalizations, they are really continuous. The phonemes run into one another. Okay, so that's a potential problem. The second problem that the units are too interdependent is that basically when we talk, as I said, we are programming all the phonemes basically in advance. And so we are sort of economizing this energy in our articulators by already putting the articulators for the next phonemes. At the end, the acoustic signal is completely mushed. So there's an illustration of that in French, where we have the phoneme re, which are already discussed before. So we have two versions. We have the voiced re, like in canard jaune, and we have the unvoiced re, like in canard flottant. So re and re are in French actually the same phoneme. They are different in other languages, but in French they happen to be the same. But they are variants that are dependent on the context. So when I talk very quickly, then I will switch from one to the other depending on the context. It doesn't matter for the hearer, because the hearer doesn't hear the difference. However, the system that tries to discover the phoneme is going to find basically 2 units here instead of 1. So these are called allophones. And this is a YouTube video that I can't play here, but it's a very funny example of people trying to communicate with a speech recognizer, trying to say the word 11 to a voice recognition system in an elevator, and they are trying all kinds of different accents. And these are all the different versions of way of saying 11, and it doesn't work, they never get to that floor. Okay, so the third problem which I alluded to was the total variation, and this is something that's very well known by people doing speech recognition, is that, but also by linguists and phoneticians, is that the way we talk depends on the person who is talking. So we already know that we are using slightly different words. Everybody is using slightly different vocabulary, but perhaps less well known, we are also applying different way of translating these words into acoustic signals, because we have different shapes of vocal tract. We are applying different kind of rules or different kind of phonetic implementation of the abstract forms. So in the end, we have quite a bit of variation across over. So it means that this attempt of doing unsupervised clustering, starting from raw speech, didn't work really. We didn't discover phonemes, contrary to what we were expecting, or at least we were led to expect based on the ideas of what infants could do. But maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe infants do not discover phonemes. Who cares? They discover these fragments of phonemes that are context-dependent and talker-dependent. Is that really a problem? Well, it sort of is, at least for the rest of the theory, because if you believe that you are using this kind of representation, which I call allophone here, and then you do segmentation to find the words, and then you do grammar induction, these algorithms, they were supposing that this first step was completely perfect. What happens now if you feed these other algorithms unperfect representations that like the one we discovered? And so this is not very clear to read, but basically in this study, Dupoux, who did a PhD with me, applied a segmentation algorithm on the basis of allophones instead of phonemes. And this is the performance that you get. So here, when you have a very good performance, it means that you have successfully found the words in the signal. So basically, yeah, I didn't explain this problem of segmentation, but because it's not a problem that's completely intuitive. We all have the impression that words are sort of present themselves as discrete units. But of course, in the signal, they are not separated by any kind of blank. It's not like in a written page where you have blanks between letters, between words. In speech, it's a continuous. So the problem of finding the word boundaries is a real one, and one that has been studied by segmentation algorithms that automatically try to find the words boundaries. Okay, so this is the performance of these algorithms. When here they are just based on the perfect transcription in terms of phoneme, but there, if you go to the right, you have more and more allophones, and you can see the performance is dropping. This is French, this is in English, this is in Japanese. Japanese is becoming really very bad, below even chance level. Okay, so it means that these algorithms don't like at all if you don't have correct phonemes here. If you have allophones, the performance starts to drop, which means that you won't find the words. So if you don't find the phonemes, you don't find the words, and if you don't find the words, you don't find the rules. So the whole thing is completely crashed. This is another way of measuring this that was reported by Aaron Johnson last year. Basically, it's the same problem. This time, if you completely bypass the allophonic clustering and you try to directly find the words from the signal, then the performance is completely finding the words is extremely difficult. Okay, so it really matters, this problem of finding the phonemes. So, where are we? Phonemes are not learnable acoustically if you just have the acoustic signals directly. So how could you repair this problem? You could do a better clustering, basically. Try to improve that. Maybe the successive place splitting is not good enough. Maybe you want to have a good auditory model based on what we know about audition, what the brain is doing, etc., etc. So you could try to improve the bottom model. Or you could try to use the top-down, with some top-down information. So I'm going to give you two examples of research, one in each, to illustrate where we are now with trying to solve that problem. But if you have any questions up to now, you can ask.
Just one little question about the procedure. I speak about accented vowels or accented syllables, and not accent. If the word has got one accented syllable, it should have a very clear sound in the accented syllable. And other syllables can be very distorted. So when you are speaking about different distorted sounds, and it's very difficult to find phonemes for infants. What do you mean exactly? This stressed or, or not stressed, or the whole system?
That's an excellent question. So so it's true that in natural speech you have different degrees of prominence. There are prominent syllables, prominent positions. There are also positions like the beginning and end of sentences, etc., where the signal is different. The signal is slower, perhaps more articulated, etc., etc. So in the experiment I described, we try to learn the whole thing. So we present the system complete with sentences, and then we try to construct a representation for the whole sound system. Now you're perfectly right that one possible answer, which is actually would be like a third option, is maybe what babies are doing is not trying to learn everything. Babies are trying to focus on these prominent parts of the speech and discard the rest of the signal.
And this was very highly connected with intonation. And this is the first thing that is learned and perceived by an infant in your table.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, so that's an excellent suggestion, and that's something that can be tried. And if you are interested to collaborate in this,
yes, I'm interested in question. What is intonation? What is a question? What is an affirmative state? And how they evolved. What was the first question, or an imperative sentence, or an affirmative sentence?
Okay,
it's very interesting.
So there are actually some work in prominence, trying to detect automatically prominent syllables, and then try to bootstrap that, to use that information to extract acoustic information, and that's an excellent suggestion. I think at this point, what's important to note is that all of this is pretty much open. And this is a very new research area, trying to combine basically approaches from signal processing and machine learning with data on what infants are doing and how they are perceiving speech. And so I think any idea is welcome to try to approach that problem. Okay, so I'm going to focus first on this bottom-up model, but I'm not going to say much about that. So this is basically a summary of where we are in terms of basically speech processing proposals. So there you get this continuum between completely fake input, which I described, that you just draw a Gaussian distribution, and you sample a Gaussian distribution and try to learn from that. Then you can have more simplified input, then like for instance just syllables. You have corpora of rare speech, like the timid corpus, and then you have casual speech, which is like the most difficult. You can also have somewhere in the middle, maybe infant-directed speech, which perhaps has different properties. Okay, so this is going from fake input to realistic input. And this is basically supervised algorithms and unsupervised algorithms. So where the technology is right now, and where Google Speech and Microsoft Speech, etc., is basically now they are dealing with casual speech, okay, over the phone. So it's even more degraded, and they are doing that now basically with deep belief networks and basically neural networks, heavy trained with 1,000 hours of labels. So that's the state of the art. It's heavily supervised. It really requires large databases that have been annotated by humans. And it's basically as if you were to say to your child during 1,000 hours, this is an A, this is an R, this is an O, learn that, okay, and repeat until the child knows what it does. So that's not realistic, but that's state of the art. Now, the unsupervised algorithms are more like coordinate maps, some version of EM, and also some deep belief networks have been proposed in a non-supervised way. But most of them have been dealing with fake input. So where we need to go now is here. We need to go to a place where we are using some of the technology that's adapted to realistic input and some of the ideas of unsupervised clustering and propose algorithms that would have both characteristics and learn spontaneously from speech. Now, I talk about the successive state splitting algorithm. There are a number of other more recent proposals that have been proposed. But before we can look at these, what's very important is to know how we could evaluate what they are doing. Before I was, when I presented the output of this successive state splitting algorithm, we were a little bit we didn't know what to do with it at first, because what you have is you have a large network of states. If you do a deep belief network, you will have hidden units. Okay, so how do you know that the system has learned what it's supposed to learn? Because in a non-supervised fashion, non-supervised system, it's not learning phoneme, it's learning a representation that you have to decode now. Now it's basically as if you had a piece of brain, and you want to know what that piece of brain is coding for. So now you turn into a physiologist and you try to decode what the system is doing. And so for this, there are a number of approaches. The traditional approach has been to measure phone error rate. That is, but you can't measure phoneme error rate on the basis of this unsupervised representation. What you have to do is you have to decode it. And that's what we did with the successive state splitting. We decoded by training a finite state conductor, taking the output of the states and turning that into phonemes. And then you can evaluate the phoneme error rate. Okay? But the problem is that now you are relying on another piece of technology which you have to train, which is your decoder. And you don't know completely, you are not completely sure whether the end product, the error rate that you get is based on is due to the phone decoder itself or due to your unsupervised representation. So that's a big problem. Also, we don't even know whether phonemes are the right unit to evaluate the signal against. We don't know whether unit babies are using phonemes. They are using something, we know, that some representation that's stable enough to remove all these variations of talkers and context, etc., but we are not sure it's phonemes. So maybe we shouldn't be measuring the phoneme error rate. So the unsupervised answer that's starting to emerge in the community is the idea that we should use some kind of word discrimination measure. And by this, the question is now, are dog and doll the same word across talk, for instance? Okay, so there are two proposals, the same different task and the ABX task that I'm going to present. So the same different task goes like this. You give two words, dog and doll, and you have to decide whether it's the same word or not. Okay? You don't tell the system whether there are phonemes in there, you don't care, just present these two words. And that's the task. And so, to measure that, then now you present dog to your system, you present doll to your system, you end up with two representations, for instance, patterns of activation in your neural network. And you try to compare them and make a measure of the distance between dog and doll. Okay? So you have, I mean, since they may not have the same duration, you may have to adjust the duration of them using dynamic time warping. But then now you have a measure of the distance between dog and doll. Or dog, or one token and dog, another token of dog. So this is here what you get. You get this distribution here is the distribution of distances between two words that are identical, okay, dog and dog. Okay, so this axis is the dynamic time warping distance, and this is basically the density of that distribution. So in black, you see the distribution for identical words, and in dotted lines, you see the distribution for different words. So this is dog, dog, this is dog, dog. So we can see now that the two distributions are actually quite separate, but this was obtained for words that are spoken by the same talker. Okay? When the words are spoken by different talkers, then you have the distribution in gray. They are much closer to one another. There is actually quite a great deal of overlap. So now if you have dog by one talker and doll by another one, it's very difficult to know whether it's the same word or not. Okay? Because these words are close together and the talker are sort of introducing extra dimensions of difficulty. So, anyway, so that's the logic of the same different evaluation technique. And so basically to derive a number, what you do is you put a threshold, and in this threshold, if it's lower, you say it's the same word, if it's higher, you say it's a different word. You can draw the rock curve and make measures like this in order to decide to quantify the output of your model. And so in this paper that we did with Aaron Johnson, we compared different types of speech features. So this is the NFCC features. If you know anything about speech, this is the sort of standard way of representing speech sounds in most phoneme recognizers, in your telephone. These are different features, PRP and other kind of features. And there you can, in this number here, represent the error, not the error, the percent correct in saying whether it's the same word or not. So the performance is not very good. It's around 40% correct. Here, this is with a supervised trained system, state of the art. You have 84% correct. And these are with various kind of non-supervised systems. Okay, and what's striking to me is that basically the performance of the unsupervised system is not very different from doing nothing at all, from just using the same speech features that you were starting from. So these kind of measures are useful because then you can realize that you can do very sophisticated things, and in the end it doesn't really help much to find the words. Okay, so that's useful. So the ABX task is basically a variant of that. It's just something that makes it closer to what we know as psychologists when you are evaluating people. The ABX task is like this. I give you dog by one talker, doll by the same talker, and then dog by a different talker. Dog. Okay, now you have to judge whether this dog is more similar to dog or doll. And you have to say which one is A or B. So it's a simple task. Just say A or B. And then you can compute D prime. It's really a psychophysical task. And you can, for instance, plot the D prime here as a function of signal to noise. So these are humans doing the task with stimuli presented in noise. And so here there's no noise, and here there's more noise, and you can see the performance of humans is dropping. But this is the performance of the NFCC. These are the state-of-the-art features, speech features that are used for phoneme recognition. You can see it's not doing very well. Okay, so there is a room for improvement from these speech features to explaining what the humans are doing. This kind of task. Okay. There you can see that the performance is actually also of the speech features is changing if you go from trying to say to do the ABX task with isolated words like doll, I just say it like that, or within a sentence or in a spontaneous conversation. The performance is getting worse and worse because when you speak in a sentence, of course, you have more and more context effects. Okay, so basically all we have been doing in this area of finding unsupervised features for speech has been concentrated for the moment in finding the right way of evaluating them. I have not much to say except perhaps one experiment that we did very recently with Gabriel Sinev, one of my postdoc. So this is using deep belief networks. So if you know a little bit neural networks, this is a type of network proposed by Jeffrey Hinton. It's a strictly Boltzmann machine. Typically what it's trying to do is you have input net units here, you have hidden units, and you present some input code there, and the system, what the system is trying to learn is to reconstruct the input. Okay, statistically, so you train it to try to reproduce what was presented there. Okay. So it's basically trying to capture the statistics of the signal. And so once you have done that, then you freeze everything, and then you add another layer, and then you also train this network to reproduce its inputs, and you can stack like this a certain number of layers. And so what you get here, and then you can basically look at the receptor field, so to speak, of this network, and see whether it looks anything like what we know the receptor fields are for auditory cortex, for instance. But so what he did was to measure, this is here the phone call rate, but he did it also for using the ABX task that I presented before. So you can compute, okay, how well are these representations suited for decoding representing phonemes, etc., etc. And so this is the performance here. So the error rate should be low. When it's low, it's good. When it's high, it's not good. This is the performance of the MFCC. This is the deep belief network without any training. And what's funny is that it's already doing slightly better than the. So this is just random connections. So these are sometimes random connections help. But then after the training, this training I talked about, it's actually getting back to where it was before. So it's not really learning much in this unsupervised fashion. However, when you start to apply supervised learning, which is what Jeff Hinton is doing, this actually deep belief architecture is what is used now in Google speech. It's really the state-of-the-art architecture. Then you start to see the error rate to drop if you do it. After the pre-training you do supervised training. And what's sort of slightly counterintuitive is that the pre-training is helping the supervised training. It didn't do anything on itself. So there is no difference between no pre-training and pre-training. But now if you follow that by supervised training, then it's better to have started with pre-training than starting from random weight. So it's interesting. It's something that you discover if you start to look into this evaluation. Of course, the speech engineers that are developing this network, they are only interested in this plot here because they are doing heavily supervised training. We are interested in what's going on there because maybe it doesn't have any feedback. So, so that's where it's very important to develop this evaluation techniques. Anyway, and don't really believe what's engineers tell you. They have a super nice unsupervised learning. It's not always true to me. You have to evaluate them seriously. So enough with that. I'm going to now move to the second idea of using top-down information. And there the idea is slightly more less intuitive, I would say. It's the idea that phonemes are part of a linguistic system. They are not alone there in the world. They are part of a coherent system. And so maybe if you try to learn the whole system, then it will actually help you to learn the individual phonemes instead of trying to learn them one by one. Okay? So that's the idea. And we played with a number of ideas in the past, but I'm going to concentrate in the latest thing we are doing, the idea of lexical information. Now, of course, what's counterintuitive is that you think that if you learn it's easier to learn the element than to learn the whole thing. Okay? But that's not true. Your intuition is wrong in that respect. Sometimes it's easier to learn the whole thing than to learn the elements. Okay. So it started with a simple idea. Now, suppose that babies have solved the problem of learning the words. They know the words. They don't know the phonemes, but they know the words. This is like things upside down. But imagine that for an instant that they have the words somehow. And so imagine how we give them canard and canard. Okay? So they don't yet know the meaning. They just know this is a familiar form. Now what's critical, what's sort of critical in very common in many languages is that you don't find a lot of cases like this, canard, canard, two words that are identical except for one tiny little thing. These are called minimal pairs. Minimal pairs are extremely infrequent in languages. Okay? There's one counterexample here, there's African, affricate, so N and T are here. These are actually the same word except for the ending, but this is quite infrequent. Most of the times they differ in multiple ways. So now, if you find something like canard, canard, that's actually a hint that this actually may not be two words. It could be just one word. Actually, with these two things, O and P, are the same underlying phoneme. So now the algorithm would be, you have this pair of phones, you want to know whether they are same or not, re and re, and you list all the pairs of words that you can find that contain them. And that information now gives you a clue to whether this actually is the same phoneme or not. Okay, so how we test that? Well, you start with the text. Okay, looks there's a boy with a hat and body. You transcribe that into phonemes, then you change the phonemes into allophones. Like for instance, you construct random allophones, and then you take this as input to your model. And the task of the model is to cluster the allophones back into phonemes. Okay, so that's the pipeline of how you test that idea, and then you derive. Okay, so of course, so this is the idea that this would be a proxy for what the babies would get. Babies would get lots of different versions of phonemes. The te in that position, the te in this position, etc. And their task is to cluster them back into a single category, a single more abstract category. Okay. So now, so for me, so the babies, the assumption here is that babies are able to distinguish all these different sounds that are very specific. They somehow know some words, or they know the words, and with this, they should be able to cluster back the phonemes. We tested that with a corpus of Japanese, continuous Japanese, 40 hours transcribed into phonemes. We made up an artificial transcription into allophones. Okay, so previously I was criticizing people who are doing artificial data, but that's what we did here. It's not really speech, it's a proxy for speech variation, but at least one that we can control. And then we use the number of minimal pairs as a proxy to decide whether the allophones are allophones or not. So we have a variable n, so we do again the curve and the compute area under the curve. The details don't really matter here, but what matters is we derive a single measure here, the area under the curve, which should be high when it's good. So when it's near 1, it's perfect. When it's at 50%, it's random. And here is the number of allophones. So when you start here, you have basically the phonemes of the language given to you, so you have nothing to do. And when you are here, you have lots and lots of allophones that you have to cluster. So the task is more and more and more difficult here. And this is performance with this idea of using the lexical information. And you can see it's doing quite well. It's actually doing, here in this particular corpus, it's doing better when you have the verb is more difficult than when it's simpler. Okay, so that was quite good. So this idea that you can use lexical information to cluster the phoneme sounds like a good idea. But of course, it's completely cheating, right? Babies don't have the words. In fact, I showed before that if you don't have the phonemes, you can't find the words. So now I'm assuming that babies don't have the phoneme, but still they have the words. So that's really is cheating. Yes. So this is a case of circularity, which I said before that some of the modeling problem approaches have this problem of circularity. I'm assuming something to help me something else, doing something else. Okay, so but then Antti Martin, who was a postdoc in the lab, found a beautiful solution. He said, well, maybe we don't need to have the real lexicon. Maybe we can use a proxy. We can use a proto-lexicon of things that were segmented. We know that segmentation is going to be very difficult because we don't have the phonemes. So it's going to be a very, very bad approximation of the words that the baby should know. And so he tried a really stupid algorithm. You find basically the most frequent n-grams in your text, and you make a lexicon out of that, and you declare this is my lexicon. And when you test that algorithm with the same principle as before, then this is the performance of the n-gram. So this is actually quite good. I mean, it's slightly less good than the actual gold lexicon, but it's not bad at all, especially compared to other things that we tried in this paper. So there, the sort of the bottom line is that this idea of top-down, which may seem a bit bizarre at the beginning, you say, well, you assume that you have something which you couldn't possibly have, and that helps you. It's actually working because you don't need to have the top completely gold. You need to have very approximate information at the top level can help you nevertheless to acquire something downstream. So then I had a PhD student who tried something even more crazy. And he said, well, if you can use the lexicon, why not using the semantics? Okay. So, and he came up with this counterexample to French. So, in French, so we have canard and canard. Okay, they are allophones. That's fine. But what about these minimal pairs that exist in French, canard and canal? Okay, they are also minimal pairs, but there we don't want to confuse R and L. I mean, we would confuse R and L if we were in Japanese. For instance, Japanese don't have this distinction, but in French it's quite crucial to have the distinction between R and L. So, so there, this lexical approach is not going to work for everything. But of course, the canard, which is actually not a canard here, doesn't mean the same thing as the canal. This is animal and this is some kind of river. So if babies can have an idea, even a very vague idea of what these two words could mean, then that could help them to solve the problem. And that's also kind of useful. Okay. So now the pipeline goes like this. You start, okay. So it's basically the same thing I said before. We generated a transcription with lots of allophones. This time we use sort of more realistic allophones than the random ones we use in the Martin et al. Paper. We use allophones from a speech recognizer. So we are sort of trying to get closer to realistic input. This is actually much harder. These allophones are much harder and they actually make the previous paper to crash. Okay, and so we generate these tons of allophones in our corpus, and then again the task is to cluster them. And this time we'll use both the lexical and the semantic information. But the semantic information, how we get the semantic information? Okay, so the word segmentation, we get it with using state-of-the-art segmentation algorithms, like the one I showed can not perform very well when you have too many allophones, but still. So you use this completely unsupervised way to describe the words, and then you use what's called in natural language processing latent semantic analysis. So to just give you an intuition of what this is doing, it's typically used in Google search when you try to locate some paper that you want, also some topic, you enter words, and then you discover that sometimes it would find you documents that don't contain the word that you are given, but contain synonyms. So how does it work? I mean, how does Google know the synonym of the word? Well, they don't have some expert entering all the list of synonyms. They have derived that automatically. And the way they derive the synonyms automatically is to do this kind of latent semantic analysis. So how it works like this: you have your words here. So this is a list of all the words in English, for instance. And these are all the documents. Imagine these are web pages, okay? Now you have a very big matrix where you have your terms here and your documents. And you count how much time do I find the word dog in this document, and how much time I find the word duck and cat, etc., etc. So this is a big matrix, and then you do some kind of matrix factorization. You reduce the dimension of these matrices by this technique. And in the middle here, you have what's called sort of a semantic matrix, where you have the terms, and you have some number of dimensions that are called semantic dimensions. So now a word or a term in this representation is going to be represented by a vector. And you can compute the cosine between two vectors that give you a measure of similarity between the two words. So for instance, cats and dogs are going to have similar vectors because typically they occur in similar kind of documents. Alright, so this is the general logic, and so this is what we apply to the corpus. So we start with a corpus with lots of allophone, we cut it into words with this unsupervised technique, then we derive the semantic analysis, latent semantic analysis using that technique. So you can imagine again it's going to be really awful because most of the things are not words. Most of the things have been badly segmented anyway. Okay, and this is a very approximate representation of semantics. Okay, but still, maybe it works. And actually, it does quite well. So this is, and now what you decide, of course, you use now the cosine between two words. So you compute, for instance, the cosine between canal and canard, and you compute the cosine between canard and canard. So I said the same twice. And the hope is that if the two words are really different, the R and L are different phonemes, then the meaning are going to be different, whereas for allophones, the meaning is going to be very similar. Okay? And that's what happened. Here is the performance of the semantic information alone, and this is quite comparable to what you get if you compute the distance between the allophones, okay? The acoustic distance between allophones. And when you combine the acoustic distance between allophone and semantic distance between allophone, you get extremely high result here. So it means that typically with the semantic information and the acoustic information, you can solve the problem. Okay. And so for me, it's really surprising because I would have, if you asked me 2 years ago whether kids could be using semantic information to help them to find the phonemes, I would say, of course not. I mean, they can't even know the words. I mean, how would they possibly do that? Well, this is a sort of proof of principle that you can, in principle, you can do that. So you can use very high level information, very bad quality, but that's going to help you solve problems at the perceptual level. Okay. So to wrap up, we started with this idea of sequential bootstrapping, where you start from the very beginning and you derive phonemes and you word forms and semantics, and you do that sequentially. You completely solve the problem before you completely solve the word before you completely solve them. So this is not working, as I showed you. It doesn't scale up at all, because first of all, you can't even start here. It crashes at the beginning. Then if you try to make this scenario work, it can be circular. And finally, it's not what babies are doing anyway, because as I told you at the beginning, they are actually learning also everything at the same time. So it's not the case that they are learning the phonemes first and the word second and semantics later. They are learning everything at once. So the kind of scenario that we are working with now, we have to deal with some kind of parallel scenario where you have the raw speech at the beginning, you extract proto-phonemes, proto-words, proto-rules and proto-semantics from it directly. And then once you have done that, you basically combine this information and you try to improve each of these levels. And you can iterate until you have something that works at the end. So this is, of course, a much more complicated model than the ones that was proposed before, but at least it's the one that has chances to work ultimately. So basically, I'm not offering you a response to this problem, I'm more offering you some kind of program, a research program. The research program then is quantitative modeling of baby language acquisition, is to, you have first of all to characterize the input, the complexity of the signal, and not try to escape by using simplified or artificial data. So that requires actually some work using real speech recorded in homes of babies, lots of them, so they can really do statistics on what kind of input the baby has. Then you have to quantify what does it mean to have an approximate lexical, an approximate semantic, an approximate syntax. These are not notions that linguists are comfortable with, but we have to derive measures to be able to quantify this, and that's what I try to illustrate with this idea, at least at the level of phonemes, using minimal pairs or using ABX task to quantify how good you are to code phonetical information. Then you have to identify potential synergies and check predictions, of course, against different data. So what do I mean by synergies? Synergies are what I actually described in the second part of my talk. So remember, we had speech features, we do some clustering, we have phonological lexical units, word forms, and semantics. So synergies are effects where when you try to learn several levels, you try to basically learn several levels at the same time, you have feedback, positive feedback. So here trying to learn the semantics directly from imperfect phonological units helps you to refine these phonological units. So this is an example of synergy, but you could have many other cases of synergy between prosody and lexical, phonology and segmentation, even semantics and maybe world knowledge that babies also have. All these levels could possibly interact. And in each of these cases, it's possible that trying to learn both at the same time is easier than learning just one. Okay, and then checking against infant data, that's of course extremely important. And this is just an experiment that has been done in the lab, trying to check the idea that babies have a proto-lexicon. So there, the experiment was that these babies would control by, with their looking time, the presentation of pseudo-words that are presented. But the pseudo-words were either pseudo-words that could have been segmented by an imperfect segmentation algorithm, like the n-gram, or they were words that would not be segmented because they are too infrequent. And babies would prefer to listen to so there were no words in that. There were all things that are not words of French, but they were preferred to listen to the n-grams that are frequent in French than the n-grams that are not frequent in French, even when controlling for diphthong probability and syllabic structure. So that's an example of predictions that were derived from the modeling that were tested in infants directly, and to check that we are not completely inventing things. Okay, but this is not enough, of course. We have many other type of things we would like to test, especially if we now expand the model to be, this is the monster model, this model where we try to specify everything that could possibly interact in baby, and there are things that are missing in this schema in order to help babies learn the first words or the first elements of the language. Now, of course, to specify this into a real model, this is not really a model, this is more a framework again. But this time we know that each of these arrows have potential candidate for algorithms. So we need, of course, to do the compositional modeling to see, okay, what are the real synergies, what are the parts of the network that could be disconnected and learned separately, etc., etc. But at the end, we will need to test that with baby data. And for this, we need new data collection methods. Because up to now, the ones that we're using in the lab mostly are behavioral techniques, like the one I talked about, where babies are looking at the screen, and then there's a sound, there's some light played on the side, and they are looking, and when they are looking, the sound is being played. These techniques have been used, and I'm not criticizing them, because they are the basis on which everything is based, everything we know about early infant acquisition is based. But they are very sparse. The baby is coming in the lab, and then you get one report if the baby is finishing the study. Sometimes they don't. They are crying, they're not happy, etc. And the signal to noise is not very good. And so Alex Christia did a wonderful series of meta-analysis trying to revisit some of the well-known established facts about language acquisition, like for instance, is it really the case that babies are learning the consonants and vowels of the language? Well, maybe, but the data is not as clean as we report some of the time. So these techniques have a lot of problems. They are really very low signal to noise. Then there are other techniques like EAG, which provides you with a lot more data per child and per experiment. They also have problems. They have movement artifacts, and they are perfect, but they are alternative methods. Then there is the NIRS, which Alex again studied, and we have done some study recently with that technique, and we are sort of happy, but not completely happy, I would say. It's still, there's a lot of improvement that could be made to make it a more reliable technique. And then there is a potentiality that also Alex is working on to collect a lot more data using tablets and recording devices that babies have at home. Because now we can test them for weeks. And then you have lots of data. You also have the natural recording. So if you're interested in all these techniques, you can talk to Alex and ask her questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
So we have some time for some questions. Can I ask you the first question? So you mentioned also feedback from parents and caregivers. So it means that through your talk you emphasize a lot on unsupervised learning, but actually real life can suggest that we have quite supervised learning. So why do you make such a fuss about unsupervised learning?
Oh, well, I mean, so unsupervised, I mean, it's the distinction, even in machine learning, is something that's really a matter of degree and perspective. But certainly it's the case that it's not the case that parents are providing the kind of supervision that you get in supervised learning in speech recognition. So they are, as I was saying, they are not providing labels for each phoneme in all the utterances that they are hearing from birth. That's for sure. Now, given that saying that they are providing no feedback would be wrong. Now the question now becomes what kind of feedback and what kind of information that does that provide at which of the level? Okay, is it the case that they are providing information regarding? They certainly are not providing much information regarding, for instance, the phonology directly, because they don't know what the phonological units are for the child. They just don't know. I mean, the only thing they have is the observation of the articulation, the babbling, and the babbling is certainly completely off compared to what they actually are able to do in perception. So if the parents are reinforcing the babbling directly, they won't really much help at least this part. So there are suggestions, having suggestions in the literature, and some people have tried algorithms like making the hypothesis that actually parents would take the babbling and guess what the child is trying to say, and then say the word. Okay. And then that would provide some kind of basically supervision, some kind of basically target that the child should try to adjust to. It's not clear how often parents are doing this. There are other kind of thing that parents could do, is that they are basically imitating what the child is doing. So in that case, it's basically providing feedback linking two different acoustic forms that should be the same across talkers, so that provides information about talker normalization. So I mean, you can think about different ways in which the feedback of the parents could influence each of the level, and basically it's possible to test that in this, if you provide it, that you have the right kind of computational architecture. I guess that up to now it's completely open. I mean, there are other people, for instance, who have proposed or who are envisioning that the parents could actually help a lot at the level of semantics and these high levels. Because, for instance, typically parents would ask questions and respond to the question. So they say, well, what are you doing? Oh, you are doing this. So now if the child has an understanding of the situation, then he can relate the question and the answer and the understanding of the situation to start to track the role of function words and try to understand, basically to build a semantic process, for instance. That could be a mode in which the parent will give information at this level. So this is, yeah, if you have other ideas, I think it's like welcome to try to test them. But certainly, yeah, I mean, what I would say regarding the supervision is that it's basically going to be weak supervision, not direct supervision. It contains information, but it's certainly not to the level at which people are used to when they are building systems to do this kind of processing.
Just asking about the name. This is the second step in understanding speech at your scheme. And did you try to measure how many times a child name should be pronounced for the child to understand that it is exactly his name, and it can be done of these very specific sounds?
Of our name? For recognition of his own name?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
it's just 6 months. And how often, how many times it should be pronounced by a parent? Did you try to measure this thing? And
do you know something?
No, I don't think there's any for that.
But we know that it's quite specific, right? Because if you change one phoneme, you change one consonant to another consonant, that's minimally different, then they don't recognize it.
And they don't recognize it when even another person pronounces it.
Do you know that?
it's always recorded by the experimenter, so it's always
So by one person.
well, it's a different person from their family, so it still counts as a new person.
Okay, and did you try to work with some of the robotic sounds? I mean, when a child is able to recognize that the sound is belonging to speech, but not to the outer world or extra linguistic factors.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you repeat?
When a child is able to recognize that the sound or a word is a speech sound, but
Okay.
not something like.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so there are a number of studies looking at preferences of speech versus non-speech sounds. The thing, as far as I remember, the babies are newborns. Initially, they are not really preferring speech as opposed to vocalizations from chimpanzees, for instance. Okay, so they are preferring vocalizations as opposed to non-vocalization sounds. But then it focuses on speech. I mean, you have more data on that? No? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we tried to do an experiment with the NIRS, doing exactly that. So we had this human use study with 5 or 6 conditions. We had speech sounds, we had emotional sounds like laughter or cry. We had non-key vocalizations, we had tones, we had spectrally scrambled sounds and all kinds of other controls. But I would say, I mean, globally, I think it's fair to say that the speech elicited was one of the stimuli that elicited the most activation, together with the monkey vocalization.
Monkey and emotional was much higher.
Okay, emotional was even higher. Okay, right. I think it's not clear. I mean, I think we have too many conditions compared to the resolution of the NIRS machine.
Does this model have any answers to how adults learn new languages? I mean, is there any added value in this general knowledge?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, adults are, in a way, you think, in a much better position to learn language than children, because they have supervision. They can go to school. There are teachers that tell them, okay, in this language, this is the consonants and vowels. You have stress, or you have that many function words. They go to, I mean, they can read, so they have all this supervision thing. And they also have a lot of feedback. They talk, I mean, whereas the newborns, I mean, the very young ones, they don't really talk, so they can't be corrected with their errors when they are very small. So you think that it's much easier, it would be much easier for adults to learn. But in fact, that's not what we found. So somehow, this completely, I mean, super complicated problem is solved much faster and with much less effort by infants than adults. And so it's a very interesting question to understand why it's the case. I mean, why is it that it's so difficult given that we have all this extra information? We also have, not only we have all this supervision, but we have a fully learned system. So we do have lots of words, we have phonetical rules, we have grammatical rules, so we can sort of basically learn the new language as a contrast to, or using part of what we know. Okay, so with all these things, it's still very difficult. And there, my own answer, but I think people will disagree, is that it has to do with the biology of the system, that there are critical periods in the relevant areas of the brain that make it much more difficult to change some of the representations. Now, you could say maybe it's more complex than that. It's basically a balance between some of these biological factors and also some. The very presence of another system could compete. So the fact that you have learned some of the features for your language may make it difficult to learn another one. But there are bilinguals that can deal with this system. So it's a long story. I've done some work on bilinguals and stuff like that. But I would say that the problem is very different from adults. And in fact, people who are doing also speech recognition, they are interested in this problem because typically that's what happens when you try to, basically you build a system for English, for instance. Google has invested lots of millions to have all this labeled data for English, and then the system fails with Indian English, because the phonemes are different, etc., etc. So what they try to do is they try to adapt the system that they have learned to this other language. So it's a little bit like when you are trying to adapt to a foreign language. But I think that what's going on with babies is really because they have no model, they have no pre-established system to hold on to.
Another question to that. So about this clustering problem of artificial speech recognition, of course, clustering is very important. How about the intelligence of the artificial system? Is it needed at all? For example, I bet that there is no sort of correlation between the intelligence of the human being and its ability to learn languages. Whereas perhaps what is needed to this artificial system, recognition artificial system, is to have some sort of intelligence to incorporate those clusters into the whole system of semantics, and perhaps that would be helpful to build these artificial systems. I mean, to have some sort of intelligence.
You're asking whether to learn this kind of system? I'm not sure.
I mean, if you take an artificial recognition system,
yes.
like, for example, like computerized system.
Right.
So one thing is to recognize and cluster the units of, be it phonemes, syllables, words, or the rest. Another story is to have some sort of intelligence to incorporate it to the whole idea of what is the language like and the rest. So, but perhaps that's different for the human. Because,
in what way would it be different?
The level of intelligence of the system. I mean, you can be very smart, but completely capable of learning other languages and
okay.
all, based on just biology of your brain. So.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know how to answer this. I think, the approach is not necessarily to build a sort of artificial baby or something like this. The idea is more to use the computational tools that we have in order to understand what's the problem, what is the nature of the problem, the learning problem. So you can view the whole approach that we're doing not so much as constructing a monster model as to basically try to understand what are the properties of the input in terms of what's the structure of natural languages, such that some system can learn it, be it a baby or a machine. For instance, I mean, for me it's not still completely clear why you can benefit so much from a very approximate semantics in terms of finding the phonemes. I mean, probably the language is structured in such a way that it's possible. You could imagine languages that wouldn't work like this. Like, for instance, languages where the semantic is completely predictable, it's completely correlated with phonology. But if you learn the semantics, it wouldn't help you with the phonology because they are correlated. One of the interesting properties of human languages is that there is no correlation. It's like the arbitrariness of the sign. And if you have two words that are very similar phonetically, they have completely different meanings. And that way, the semantic can help you. If it were correlated, it wouldn't help you. So I think this is telling us something about the structure of language, more than whether we can really believe that an artificial model would be the same as what the baby's brain is doing.
Yeah. So unfortunately we have to finish now. Thank you very much. So if you have some questions, of course you can approach our lecturer and ask these questions informally. Thank you very much for coming here.